James Carter stood at the altar of the historic Ashford estate in Connecticut, surrounded by 200 guests dressed in their finest attire, and did something that would be talked about in Manhattan's elite circles for years to come. Instead of saying the two words everyone expected, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a small remote control, and pressed play on the massive screen behind him. The romantic montage that was supposed to show tender moments of his 3-year relationship with Victoria Hayes never appeared. What filled that screen instead were crystal-clear recordings of his fiancée and his best friend Derek Stone in passionate embraces, their voices echoing through the chapel's sound system as they laughed about how easy it had been to fool the rich, trusting idiot who was about to hand them access to the Carter family fortune. Victoria's scream pierced the air before she even turned to see what had captured the collective gasp of every person in that room. When she finally looked up at the screen and saw herself whispering promises of love to Derek while mocking James's sentimental nature, her face drained of all color. She grabbed the hem of her $50,000 Vera Wang gown and ran down the aisle, her heels clicking frantically against the marble floor as 200 pairs of eyes followed her retreat. If you're watching this video, please like and subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're listening to this story from, because I want to know how far it has reached. But to understand how James Carter, a man worth over $2 billion and known throughout the business world for his sharp instincts, ended up at an altar with a woman who saw him as nothing more than a walking bank account, we need to go back 3 years. James had inherited Carter Technologies from his father, a self-made entrepreneur who had built the company from a small software startup in his garage to one of the most influential tech firms in the United States. The elder Carter had died of a sudden heart attack when James was only 28, leaving his son not just a fortune, but a legacy that weighed heavily on his shoulders. James threw himself into the company with an almost obsessive dedication, working 16-hour days and sleeping in his office more often than in his penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park. His father had always told him that in business and in life, integrity was worth more than any profit margin, and James carried that principle like a sacred oath. He was known for being fair with his employees, honest with his investors, and unwilling to cut corners even when it would have been financially advantageous. This same integrity, this same belief in the goodness of people, would become the very weapon used against him. James met Victoria Hayes at a tech conference in San Francisco, where she was presenting a marketing strategy for sustainable startups. She was brilliant, articulate, and had a way of making James feel seen in a way he hadn't experienced since his father's death. Unlike the parade of women who had thrown themselves at him once they learned his last name, Victoria seemed genuinely interested in his ideas, his vision for the company, and his thoughts on corporate responsibility. She asked questions about his childhood, about his relationship with his father, about the pressure of living up to such a monumental legacy. For the first time in years, James felt like he could breathe around someone, like he didn't have to perform the role of the untouchable billionaire CEO. Their relationship developed slowly, which James appreciated because it felt authentic in a world where everything moved at a frantic, transactional pace. Victoria didn't ask him for expensive gifts or demand to be seen at high-profile events. She had her own career, her own apartment in Brooklyn, and her own circle of friends. When James invited her to move into his penthouse after a year of dating, she hesitated, saying she didn't want to lose her independence or become one of those women who existed only as an accessory to a powerful man. That hesitation, that reluctance to immediately accept the luxury he could provide, made James trust her even more. He saw it as proof that she valued their connection over his bank account, that she was with him for reasons that had nothing to do with the Carter name or the Carter fortune. He was so convinced of her authenticity that he never noticed the carefully constructed performance, the calculated responses designed to make him feel exactly what he was feeling. Derek Stone had been James's roommate at Harvard Business School, the kind of friend who knew every version of who James had been before the weight of the company fell on his shoulders. They had stayed up countless nights studying for exams, had celebrated their first major business deals together, and had been each other's best men at what they thought would be their respective weddings. Derek worked in private equity and had his own considerable success, though nothing that approached James's level of wealth. When James introduced Derek to Victoria at a dinner party 18 months into the relationship, he was thrilled to see his best friend and his girlfriend get along so well. Victoria charmed Derek with the same intelligence and wit that had captivated James, and Derek seemed genuinely happy that his friend had found someone worthy of him. The three of them began spending more time together, weekend trips to the Hamptons, dinners at exclusive restaurants, charity galas where they moved through crowds as a tight unit. James loved having his two favorite people in the world form their own friendship, never imagining that every laugh they shared, every inside joke they developed, was laying the groundwork for his ultimate betrayal. The proposal happened on a private beach in Santorini, with the sunset painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed almost too perfect to be real. James had planned every detail meticulously, hiring a photographer to capture the moment from a distance, arranging for a violin quartet to play Victoria's favorite classical pieces, and having 24 white roses delivered to their villa. When he got down on one knee and opened the velvet box containing a flawless 5-carat diamond ring that had belonged to his grandmother, Victoria cried tears that seemed so genuine that James felt his own eyes welling up. She said yes with a trembling voice, and in that moment James believed he had finally found the partner who would help him carry the weight of his responsibilities, someone who would build a family with him and continue the legacy his father had started. The wedding planning consumed the next 14 months of their lives, with Victoria throwing herself into every detail with an enthusiasm that James found endearing. She hired the best wedding planner in New York, selected a venue that cost $200,000 just for the rental, and designed a guest list that read like a who's who of American business and society. James gave her access to whatever resources she needed, opened a dedicated account for wedding expenses, and trusted her judgment on every decision. He was too busy managing a major acquisition at Carter Technologies to be deeply involved in the minutiae of floral arrangements and seating charts, and he was grateful that Victoria seemed to genuinely enjoy the process. What he didn't know was that every vendor she hired, every expense she approved, was carefully calculated not for the wedding itself, but for the divorce that she and Derek had already planned. The first crack in the perfect facade appeared exactly 2 weeks before the wedding, on an ordinary Tuesday evening when James came home early from the office with takeout from Victoria's favorite Thai restaurant. He found her phone on the kitchen counter, the screen lit up with a message notification. James wasn't the type to snoop through his partner's phone, but the preview of the message was impossible to ignore, because it was from Derek and it said something that made his blood run cold in his veins. The message preview read just enough to plant a seed of doubt that James couldn't ignore no matter how hard he tried. It mentioned meeting up later that night and included a heart emoji, the kind of casual intimacy that felt wrong coming from his best friend to his fiancée. James stood in his kitchen, holding the bag of Thai food that was growing cold in his hands, staring at that phone screen as if it might rearrange itself into something less suspicious. He told himself there had to be a reasonable explanation, that maybe they were planning a surprise for him, that he was being paranoid and letting the stress of the upcoming wedding mess with his judgment, but something deep in his gut, the same instinct that had helped him navigate treacherous business deals and identify dishonest partners, told him that this was different. This wasn't paranoia. This was his subconscious finally acknowledging red flags that his heart had been too invested to see. Instead of confronting Victoria immediately, James made a decision that would define everything that came next. He carefully placed her phone back exactly where he had found it, unpacked the Thai food as if nothing had happened, and when Victoria came home an hour later, he greeted her with a kiss and asked about her day with the same warmth he always did. She told him about a difficult client meeting and complained about the florist trying to upcharge them for last-minute changes to the centerpieces, and James listened and nodded and played the role of the supportive fiancé while his mind raced through possibilities. That night, after Victoria fell asleep beside him, James lay awake staring at the ceiling of their bedroom, feeling like he was standing on the edge of a cliff. He could jump to conclusions and destroy everything based on a single text message, or he could be strategic, gather information, and know for certain before making any moves. His father had taught him that in business, You never acted on incomplete intelligence, and James decided to apply that same principle to his personal life, even though every fiber of his being wanted to shake Victoria awake and demand the truth. The next morning, James called a private investigation firm that Carter Technologies had used in the past for corporate espionage cases and background checks on potential executive hires. He met with the lead investigator, a former FBI agent named Marcus Webb, in a coffee shop in Queens where nobody from his social circle would ever recognize him. James explained the situation with a calm professionalism that masked the turmoil churning in his chest, and Marcus listened without judgment, taking notes in a small leather journal. Marcus told him that in his 20 years of investigating cheating spouses, the ones who had that gut instinct were right about 90% of the time, but he also cautioned James that once you opened this door, once you confirmed your suspicions, there was no going back to the blissful ignorance of before. James nodded and said he understood, that he needed to know the truth regardless of how much it would hurt, because marrying someone under false pretenses would hurt infinitely more in the long run. Marcus put together a surveillance plan that was both comprehensive and discreet. He installed micro cameras in James's penthouse while Victoria was out at a dress fitting, tiny devices hidden in smoke detectors and picture frames that would capture every room except the bathrooms, because even in his suspicion, James maintained a baseline of decency. Marcus also assigned two of his best investigators to follow Victoria and Derek separately, tracking their movements, photographing their interactions, and documenting anything that seemed remotely suspicious. The operation would cost James $50,000, a sum that was meaningless to him, but felt obscene when he considered what he was paying for. Proof that the woman he loved and the friend he trusted were betraying him in the worst possible way. The first 72 hours of surveillance yielded nothing incriminating, and James felt a confusing mixture of relief and frustration. Maybe he had been wrong. Maybe that text message had been innocent. Maybe his paranoia was destroying something beautiful for no reason. But Marcus told him to be patient, that cheaters often had patterns and routines, and that if something was happening, they would eventually catch it on camera. On the fourth day of surveillance, Marcus called James during a board meeting and told him in a flat, professional tone that he needed to come to the office immediately because they had found something. James excused himself from the meeting, ignored the concerned looks from his executives, and drove to Marcus's office in Midtown with his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. When he arrived, Marcus led him into a private viewing room and pulled up footage on a large monitor without any preamble or attempt to soften the blow. The video showed Victoria entering a luxury hotel in Soho at 2:15 in the afternoon, wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap as if she were trying to avoid being recognized. 18 minutes later, Derek walked into the same hotel through a different entrance, and the timestamp showed both of them checking into the same room on the 7th floor. They stayed there for 3 hours and 42 minutes, and when they finally emerged separately, Victoria's hair was different and her lipstick was smudged, and Derek had that relaxed, satisfied expression of a man who had just gotten exactly what he wanted. James watched the footage in complete silence, his face a mask of controlled composure that revealed nothing of the devastation happening inside him. Marcus offered to stop the video to give James time to process, but James shook his head and told him to show him everything. There were more videos, dozens of them spanning the past 2 weeks, showing Victoria and Derek meeting at different hotels, having lunch at out-of-the-way restaurants in New Jersey and Connecticut, always careful to avoid places where they might be seen by anyone from their social circle. But the most damning evidence came from the audio recordings captured by the cameras in James's own penthouse. Conversations that Victoria and Derek had when they thought James was safely occupied at the office. In those recordings, they talked about the wedding like it was a business transaction, discussing how long Victoria would need to stay married to James before filing for divorce in order to maximize her settlement. Derek's voice was casual and confident as he told Victoria that she was doing amazing, that James suspected nothing, and that soon they would both have more money than they knew what to do with and could finally be together openly without having to sneak around. The most painful moment came when James heard Victoria laughing at something Derek said about James's proposal in Santorini. how he had been so earnest and emotional, how easy it was to cry on command when there was a 5-carat diamond involved. She mocked the way James sometimes got teary-eyed when talking about his father, called it manipulative even though James's grief had been the most genuine emotion he had ever shared with another person. Derek joined in the mockery, imitating the way James spoke about corporate responsibility and ethical business practices, turning the values that James held sacred into punchlines for their private entertainment. They talked about him like he was a mark, a wealthy fool who deserved to be taken advantage of, because anyone stupid enough to trust people at face value in a world run by money was basically asking to be exploited. James sat through 4 hours of evidence, watching and listening as Marcus methodically presented every piece of proof that his fiancée and his best friend had been conducting an affair for at least 6 months, possibly longer. The investigator had also uncovered financial records showing that Derek had significant gambling debts totaling nearly $3 million, debts that he had hidden from everyone including his own family, and that Victoria had her own financial problems stemming from a failed business venture that had left her nearly $200,000 in debt. The wedding wasn't just about love or even lust. It was a calculated rescue plan, a way for 2 desperate people to solve their money problems by exploiting the one person who had been generous enough to trust them completely. When Marcus finally turned off the monitor and asked James what he wanted to do with the information, James didn't answer immediately. He sat in the dark viewing room, feeling like every assumption he had made about his life, about his judgment of character, about his ability to read people, had been shattered into pieces too small to ever reassemble. But beneath the pain and the humiliation, something else was forming, something cold and strategic that his father would have recognized immediately. James wasn't going to cancel the wedding with a simple confrontation or a private breakup that would allow Victoria and Derek to walk away with their dignity intact. James told Marcus to continue the surveillance, but to be even more careful now because he didn't want Victoria or Derek to suspect anything had changed. He went home that night and had dinner with Victoria like he had done hundreds of times before, listening to her talk about the final details of the wedding while he nodded and smiled and offered opinions on things that no longer mattered to him. She complained about the band wanting an extra $1,000 for extending their set, and James told her to pay them whatever they asked because he wanted their wedding day to be perfect. The irony of those words hung in the air, invisible to Victoria but crushing to James, who was already planning how to turn that perfect day into something neither she nor Derek would ever forget. He played his role flawlessly, asking about her day, remembering to compliment the new dress she had bought, even suggesting they take a weekend trip to Vermont before the wedding to relax and enjoy some quiet time together. Victoria looked at him with what he used to think was love, but could now recognize as relief that her Mark was still completely under her spell. Over the next 10 days, James became a different person while maintaining the exact same exterior. He continued to run board meetings at Carter Technologies, approve budgets, make strategic decisions about acquisitions and partnerships, all while a parallel version of himself was meticulously planning something that required the same level of precision and attention to detail. He met with Marcus 3 more times, reviewing new footage that showed Victoria and Derek becoming bolder and sloppier in their affair, no longer bothering with separate hotel entrances or elaborate disguises. They had started meeting at Derek's apartment in Tribeca, spending entire afternoons there while James was supposedly too busy with work to notice his fiancée's absences. In one particularly devastating recording from James's own bedroom, Victoria was on the phone with Derek while James was in the shower, telling him how much she missed him and counting down the days until the wedding when their plan would finally be in motion. She said she could barely stand letting James touch her anymore, but that it would all be worth it when she was sitting on a beach somewhere spending his money while he dealt with the heartbreak of their inevitable divorce. James made a decision that night that would define not just his response to the betrayal, but his entire philosophy moving forward. He wasn't going to confront them privately, wasn't going to give them the opportunity to gaslight him, or beg for forgiveness, or spin some narrative that might make him doubt what he knew to be true. He was going to let them think they had won, let them go through with their performance all the way to its climax, and then he was going to expose them in the most public and undeniable way possible. The wedding had 200 guests confirmed, including CEOs, politicians, celebrities, and media personalities who would spread the story far beyond that chapel in Connecticut. Victoria wanted a big wedding because she thought it would legitimize her claim to the Carter fortune. But James was going to use that same stage to ensure that everyone who mattered in their social and professional circles knew exactly who Victoria Hayes and Derek Stone really were. He worked with Marcus to create a compilation video that was devastating in its simplicity and clarity. It started with footage of Victoria and Derek at various hotels, the timestamps clearly visible in the corner of each frame. Then it cut to audio recordings of their most damning conversations, playing over images of them laughing together, touching each other, being intimate in ways that left no room for interpretation or excuse. The video included the conversation where they mocked James's proposal, where they discussed divorce timelines and settlement amounts, where Derek joked about James being too sentimental and stupid to see what was happening right in front of him. Marcus edited it with the precision of a documentary filmmaker, making sure every piece of evidence was clear and irrefutable, time-stamped and geotagged so that there could be no claims of manipulation or fabrication. James also made calls to his attorney, a shark named Robert Chen, who had handled some of the most contentious divorces and business disputes in New York history. He explained the situation and asked Robert what legal protections he could put in place before the wedding day. Robert worked quickly, drafting documents that would ensure Victoria got nothing from James financially, no matter what happened. He also started a quiet investigation into Derek's business dealings, looking for anything that could be used as leverage later. James wanted to make sure that when this was over, both of them would face consequences that extended far beyond public humiliation. The week before the wedding, James did something that required every ounce of self-control he possessed. He threw an intimate rehearsal dinner at one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, a private room overlooking the city skyline, where 50 of their closest friends and family gathered to celebrate the upcoming union. James stood up to give a toast, holding a glass of champagne that caught the light from the crystal chandeliers above, and he spoke about love and trust and partnership with such genuine emotion that several guests wiped tears from their eyes. He talked about how Victoria had changed his life, how she had taught him to open his heart again after years of burying himself in work, how grateful he was to have found someone who loved him for who he was rather than what he had. He thanked Derek for being the brother he never had, for always being there through every triumph and challenge, for being the kind of friend that every man hopes to have, but few are lucky enough to find. Victoria cried during the speech, reaching over to squeeze James's hand, and Derek raised his glass with a smile that James now recognized as the expression of a man who thought he was getting away with the perfect crime. What none of them knew was that James had already coordinated with the technical team at the Ashford estate, the venue where the ceremony would take place. He had arranged for a massive LED screen to be installed behind the altar, ostensibly to display a romantic video montage during the reception. He had personally delivered a USB drive to the audiovisual technician, explaining that it contained the surprise video he wanted to play, and he had paid the man an extra $5,000 to ensure that nobody, especially not Victoria or the wedding planner, would preview the content before the ceremony. The technician, a 25-year-old kid named Tyler who had worked hundreds of weddings, thought it was just another groom wanting to surprise his bride with a sentimental slideshow. He had no idea that the video would detonate like a bomb in front of 200 witnesses and change multiple lives in the span of 10 minutes. James also made arrangements that demonstrated just how thoroughly he had thought through every aspect of what was about to happen. He hired additional security for the venue, ostensibly to manage the high-profile guest list, but actually to ensure that Victoria and Derek couldn't physically attack him or destroy the equipment once the video started playing. He had his attorney on standby with security footage and legal documents ready to be filed the moment the ceremony ended. He even arranged for a car to be waiting for him at a side entrance of the estate, a black SUV with tinted windows that would allow him to leave immediately after the revelation, without having to face the chaos and questions that would inevitably follow. Every detail was planned with the same meticulous attention he brought to billion-dollar business deals, because this wasn't just about exposing cheaters, It was about reclaiming his dignity and sending a message that James Carter was nobody's fool. The night before the wedding, James stayed in a hotel suite by himself despite Victoria's protests that it was bad luck for them to be apart. He told her he wanted to honor the tradition, to make their reunion at the altar even more special, and she accepted this explanation with a kiss and a promise that tomorrow would be the beginning of their forever. After she left, James sat on the balcony of his suite overlooking the city, drinking a glass of whiskey and thinking about his father. The old man had always said that the measure of a person wasn't how they acted when things were going well, but how they responded when they were betrayed or knocked down. James had been knocked down harder than he ever thought possible, had his trust violated by the two people he held closest to his heart, but he wasn't going to let that destroy him or turn him into someone bitter and broken. He was going to respond with the same intelligence and strategic thinking that had made him successful in every other area of his life. As he finished his drink and prepared for bed, James felt something unexpected wash over him. It wasn't anger anymore, though that was certainly still there beneath the surface. It was a cold clarity, a sense of purpose that felt almost peaceful in its certainty. Tomorrow he would stand at that altar, in front of everyone who mattered in his world, and he would execute a plan that would expose Victoria and Derek for exactly what they were. He would do it calmly, methodically, without rage or hysteria, because the truth would be devastating enough on its own, without him having to add emotional theatrics. The morning of the wedding arrived with perfect weather, the kind of crystalline September day that wedding planners dream about and photographers charge extra to capture. James woke up in his hotel suite at 6 in the morning, went for a run through Central Park to clear his head, and then returned to shower and prepare for what he knew would be the most significant day of his life, though not for the reasons anyone else expected. His groomsmen arrived at 9, a group of college friends and business associates who had no idea what was about to unfold, and they helped him into his custom-made Tom Ford tuxedo while making jokes about the end of his bachelor freedom and offering mock-serious advice about married life. Derek was among them, playing the role of best man with an ease that made James marvel at how completely he had misjudged someone he thought he knew better than almost anyone. Derek straightened James's bow tie and clapped him on the shoulder, telling him how happy he was to see his best friend finally settling down with an amazing woman. And James smiled and thanked him while thinking about how satisfying it would be to watch that smug expression crumble in just a few hours. The Ashford estate looked like something out of a fairy tale, with white flowers adorning every surface, silk drapes hanging from ancient oak trees, and the chapel itself glowing in the afternoon sunlight, like a scene from a romantic movie. Victoria had spared no expense on the decorations, and James had to admit that she had exquisite taste, even if every beautiful detail was paid for with money she planned to eventually take from him in a divorce settlement. Guests began arriving at noon, stepping out of luxury cars and limousines, the women in designer gowns and the men in expensive suits, all of them excited to witness what society pages would call the wedding of the year. They had no idea they were about to witness something far more memorable, something that would be discussed in whispers and gossip columns for months to come. James greeted early arrivals with his characteristic charm, shaking hands and accepting congratulations, while his mind ran through his plan one final time, checking for any detail he might have missed, any variable that could derail what needed to happen. At 1:30, the wedding coordinator, a stern woman named Patricia who treated every event like a military operation, gathered the wedding party in a private room adjacent to the chapel. She went through the procession order one final time, explaining where everyone needed to stand, when they needed to walk, and what signals to watch for. James listened with apparent attention, while his heart hammered in his chest with an intensity that surprised him. He had given presentations to boards of directors, negotiated deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars, faced hostile shareholders and aggressive competitors, but none of that compared to the adrenaline coursing through him now. This wasn't business, this was deeply personal, and the stakes were his pride, his reputation, and his ability to trust anyone ever again. Patricia asked if he had any questions, and James shook his head, telling her that everything was perfect, that he was ready, and that today would be a day nobody in attendance would ever forget. Victoria was sequestered in the bridal suite on the opposite side of the estate, surrounded by her bridesmaids and her mother, all of them fussing over her dress and makeup and hair. James had seen her briefly that morning when their paths crossed in the hotel lobby, and even knowing what he knew, even carrying the weight of her betrayal like a stone in his chest, he had to acknowledge that she looked beautiful. She had smiled at him with what seemed like genuine affection, told him she couldn't wait to become his wife, and James had smiled back and told her that he had a special surprise planned for the ceremony, something she would never see coming. She had laughed and told him she loved surprises, and he had walked away thinking about how true that statement was about to become, though not in any way she could possibly imagine. The string quartet began playing at exactly 2 o'clock, the signal that the ceremony was about to begin. Guests filed into the chapel and took their seats in pews decorated with white roses and silk ribbons, programs printed on expensive cardstock resting on each seat. The massive LED screen behind the altar displayed a simple, elegant pattern, and several guests commented on what a nice touch it was, how modern and sophisticated, never suspecting what that screen would soon reveal. James took his position at the altar alongside the officiant, a judge who was a family friend and who had agreed to perform the ceremony as a personal favor. The processional began with the bridesmaids walking down the aisle in their champagne-colored gowns, each one perfectly styled and smiling at the assembled guests who turned in their seats to watch. Derek walked beside the maid of honor, Victoria's sister Amanda, and James watched his former best friend move through the ceremony with the casual confidence of someone who believed he had successfully deceived everyone in the room. The music swelled as the doors at the back of the chapel opened one final time, and Victoria appeared on her father's arm, backlit by the afternoon sun streaming through the entrance, looking every bit the radiant bride that 200 guests expected to see. She moved down the aisle with practiced grace, her veil trailing behind her, her bouquet of white peonies held perfectly at waist level, and when her eyes met James's across the distance, she gave him a smile that he might have once believed was filled with love, but now recognized as the expression of someone who thought their performance had been flawless. Victoria reached the altar, and her father lifted her veil, kissed her cheek and placed her hand in James's, before stepping back to his seat in the front pew. The officiant welcomed everyone and began speaking about marriage as a sacred bond between two people who choose to build a life together based on trust, honesty, and mutual respect. James felt the irony of those words settle over the chapel like a heavy blanket, and he wondered how many of the guests were thinking about their own marriages, their own secrets, their own betrayals, large and small. The officiant moved through the standard ceremony language, talking about the journey that James and Victoria had taken to reach this moment, and James let him speak for exactly 7 minutes before he raised his hand in a polite gesture that made the officiant pause mid-sentence with a confused expression. James turned to face the guests, his voice calm and clear as he thanked everyone for coming to witness what he had thought would be the happiest day of his life. He spoke about how much it meant to have all of them there, people who had supported him through the loss of his father, through the challenges of running a major company, through all the ups and downs that life had thrown at him. He said that he had always believed in being honest and transparent, values his father had instilled in him, and that he thought it was important to bring that same honesty to this moment. Victoria stood beside him with a frozen smile, probably thinking he was about to deliver some heartfelt speech about their love, while Derek shifted uncomfortably in his position as best man, perhaps sensing that something was off, but not yet understanding the magnitude of what was about to happen. James pulled the small remote control from his pocket, the same remote that had been carefully hidden in his tuxedo jacket, and he told the assembled guests that before they proceeded with the ceremony, he wanted to share a video that would provide important context for the commitment he was about to make. Several people chuckled, thinking this was some kind of sweet romantic gesture, a montage of their relationship set to music. The lights in the chapel dimmed slightly as James pressed play, and the elegant pattern on the LED screen dissolved into the first frame of footage that Marcus had so carefully compiled. The timestamp in the corner read 11 days ago, and the image showed Victoria entering the lobby of a boutique hotel in Soho, her face partially hidden by sunglasses and a baseball cap, but still clearly recognizable to anyone who knew her. The chapel fell into absolute silence as the video continued, showing Derek entering the same hotel 18 minutes later, both of them converging on room 712. The footage was crisp and undeniable, professionally shot by investigators who knew exactly how to capture evidence that would hold up in any court of law. James heard Victoria gasp beside him, heard her voice saying his name in a tone that combined confusion and dawning horror. But he didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the guests, watching their faces transform from polite interest to shock to absolute scandalized fascination as they realized what they were witnessing. The video moved from hotel footage to audio recordings, and suddenly the chapel's sound system filled with Victoria's voice talking to Derek about the wedding as if it were a business deal, discussing divorce timelines and settlement amounts with the casual tone of someone ordering coffee. The audio recording played Victoria's laugh, echoing through the chapel as she mocked James's proposal in Santorini, calling him hopelessly romantic and saying how easy it had been to cry on command when a 5-carat diamond was involved. Her voice dripped with contempt as she described his emotional speeches about his father as manipulative, even though everyone in that room knew that James's grief had been the most raw and genuine thing they had ever witnessed. Derek's voice joined hers on the recording, imitating the way James spoke about ethical business practices and corporate responsibility, turning his deeply held values into punchlines for their private amusement. The video showed more footage of them together at different locations, intimate moments that left no doubt about the physical nature of their relationship, and then it cut to the most damning conversation of all, recorded in James's own bedroom while he had been in the shower. Victoria's voice told Derek that she could barely stand letting James touch her anymore, that she was counting down the days until the wedding when their plan would finally be in motion, that soon they would both be rich and free, and together while James dealt with the heartbreak of their divorce. The scream that tore from Victoria's throat was primal and desperate, a sound of pure panic that shattered the stunned silence in the chapel. She grabbed James's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his tuxedo sleeve, trying to turn him away from the screen, trying to make him stop the video that was systematically destroying her carefully constructed life. But James simply removed her hand with a gentle firmness that showed more restraint than she deserved, and took a step back, letting the video continue to play while 200 guests sat frozen in their seats, unable to look away from the train wreck unfolding before them. Victoria looked at the screen and then back at the guests, her face cycling through emotions so quickly that it was almost fascinating to watch, denial and rage and terror all competing for dominance. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to offer some explanation or excuse, but what could she possibly say when the evidence was playing in high definition for everyone to see and hear? Derek had gone completely pale, his usual confident swagger evaporating as he realized that his entire social and professional reputation was being obliterated in real time. He looked at James with an expression that might have been pleading or might have been calculating, trying to figure out if there was any way to salvage this situation, or if he should just cut his losses and run. James met his gaze with a cold steadiness that answered that unspoken question. And Derek must have seen something in those eyes that told him there would be no forgiveness, no second chances, no opportunity to explain away what everyone had just witnessed. The video reached its conclusion with a final timestamp and a fade to black, and the chapel lights came back up to reveal a scene of absolute chaos, barely contained by social convention and shock. Victoria finally found her voice, and it came out as a desperate attempt at damage control, words tumbling over each other as she tried to claim that the videos were fake, that someone had manipulated them, that this was all some kind of misunderstanding or elaborate setup. But her protestations sounded hollow and panicked, even to her own ears, especially when several guests were already pulling out their phones to record what was happening, to capture this moment for posterity, or perhaps for the social media posts that would inevitably follow. Victoria's mother stood up from her seat in the front row, her face a mask of humiliation and fury, though it was unclear if that fury was directed at her daughter or at James for exposing her daughter's actions so publicly. Victoria's father sat motionless, staring at his daughter as if seeing her for the first time, the disappointment on his face so profound that it was almost painful to witness. James finally spoke, his voice cutting through the rising murmur of shocked conversations and gasps. He said that he had brought everyone here today to witness what he thought would be a marriage built on love and trust, but instead they had witnessed the truth about the woman he had almost bound himself to legally and financially. He said that he was grateful to have discovered Victoria's true nature before making that irreversible commitment, and that he hoped this served as a reminder to everyone present about the importance of choosing partners who valued integrity over opportunity. He thanked them for coming and apologized for wasting their time, though his tone made it clear he wasn't really sorry for anything, except having been foolish enough to trust Victoria and Derek in the first place. He told the guests that the reception dinner would still be served in the estate's banquet hall, that he had paid for everything, and saw no reason to let good food go to waste, and that they were welcome to stay and enjoy it if they wished. Victoria let out another scream, this one tinged with rage rather than panic, and she grabbed the hem of her $50,000 wedding gown and ran down the aisle toward the exit. Her veil caught on one of the pew decorations and tore away from her hair, trailing behind her like a white flag of surrender as she fled the chapel in her expensive heels. The sound of those heels clicking frantically against the marble floor echoed through the space, punctuated by her sobbing breaths, and every single person in that room watched her retreat with a mixture of horror and undeniable fascination. Derek tried to follow Victoria out of the chapel, but found his path blocked by two security guards that James had strategically positioned near the exits. The guards didn't physically restrain him, but their presence made it clear that Derek wasn't leaving until James decided he could leave, and that power dynamic played out in front of everyone who was still processing what they had just witnessed. Derek turned back to face James with desperation in his eyes, and for a moment it looked like he might try to offer some kind of apology or explanation. But James simply shook his head and told the guards to let him go. There was no point in keeping Derek there because the damage was already done, the truth already exposed, and anything Derek said now would just be pathetic noise. Derek practically ran from the chapel, his role as best man abandoned along with any shred of dignity he might have walked in with, and James watched him go with the satisfaction of knowing that Derek's gambling debts would now be compounded by the professional and social exile that would inevitably follow this very public humiliation. The guests sat in stunned silence for several long moments after both Victoria and Derek had fled, unsure if they should leave or stay or offer condolences or simply pretend this had never happened. James made the decision easier for them by walking down the aisle himself with his head held high, nodding politely to people as he passed, acting for all the world like he had just completed exactly what he set out to do, rather than having his wedding implode in spectacular fashion. Several of his closer friends and business associates approached him in the vestibule of the chapel, offering support and expressing shock at what Victoria and Derek had done, and James accepted their concern with grace, while making it clear that he was fine, that he had known about the affair for 2 weeks, and had planned this exposure deliberately. The revelation that he had orchestrated the entire confrontation, rather than being blindsided at the altar, seemed to shift the narrative in real time, transforming him from a victim into a strategic mastermind who had turned his own wedding into a public trial. In the weeks and months that followed, the fallout from that day rippled through New York's social and business circles with the force of a tidal wave. Victoria found herself completely ostracized from the circles she had worked so hard to penetrate, with former friends and colleagues refusing to take her calls or acknowledge her existence. The marketing firm where she worked quietly let her go after several high-profile clients, expressed discomfort with having her represent their brands, and her attempts to find new employment were consistently blocked by the fact that everyone in her industry had either seen the video or heard about it from someone who had. Derek's situation was even worse, because his gambling debts, which James's attorney had quietly leaked to the right people, combined with his betrayal of his best friend, made him toxic in the private equity world, where trust and relationships were everything. He lost clients, lost partnerships, and eventually had to declare bankruptcy when his creditors came calling and he had no resources left to pay them. James threw himself into his work at Carter Technologies with renewed focus and energy, channeling the pain of betrayal into building something meaningful. He promoted several junior executives who had shown loyalty and integrity, restructured the company's charitable foundation to focus on supporting people who had been victims of financial fraud or betrayal, and personally funded a scholarship program for business students who demonstrated strong ethical principles. 6 months after the wedding that never was, James met someone new at a tech conference in Seattle, a software engineer named Rachel, who knew nothing about his wealth or social status when they first started talking about artificial intelligence applications. Their relationship developed slowly and carefully, with James taking his time to truly know her before allowing himself to trust again, and while he never forgot the lessons Victoria and Derek had taught him, he refused to let their betrayal turn him into someone cynical or closed off from genuine connection. The story of the billionaire groom who exposed his cheating fiancée at the altar became something of an urban legend in certain circles, told and retold with varying degrees of accuracy, but always with the same central truth: that James Carter had taken the worst betrayal of his life and transformed it into a moment of powerful public justice. He never spoke about it in interviews or allowed it to define his public persona. But privately, he knew that standing at that altar and pressing play on that remote control had been one of the most important decisions he had ever made. It wasn't about revenge in the cruel sense. It was about refusing to be a victim, about exposing the truth when everyone around him had been complicit in a lie, and about setting a standard for his own life that said he would rather face painful reality than comfortable deception. The experience changed him in ways both subtle and profound, teaching him that trust should be earned rather than freely given, that love without honesty was worthless, and that sometimes the strongest thing a person could do was walk away from something that looked perfect on the surface but was rotten at its core. James Carter had stood at an altar in front of 200 witnesses and chosen truth over comfort, dignity over denial, and his own peace of mind over the approval of people who valued appearance more than integrity, and in doing so, he had reclaimed not just his fortune but something far more valuable: his sense of self-worth and his faith in his own judgment.